Alright, so next we do Love Canal, which is unfortunately not as fun as it sounds. So here is an image of the site. This was probably taken in the 1970s. It's here at Niagara Falls in New York, right? So there's a bridge here from Niagara Falls, which is not just like the waterfall natural feature itself, but also the town nearby and Canada, right? Yeah, so this is what it looks like today. This is not what it looked like during the disaster era, which we'll go back to. A town of maybe 50,000, right? Located over here. Okay, so we're going to go back to this as our starting point. Development of hydroelectric power. This is on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This is the first hydroelectric dam or harnessing of power that had ever been developed in the United States, and you shouldn't laugh at it because it was their first one ever, okay? They just didn't know. Okay. 1890, right? So a little bit after, largely inspired by this development on the Fox River, you have this person, William T. Love, who is, I don't know, sort of a rise and grind type, I guess, right? He's like Elon Musk at home, basically. He had this idea for like a perfect planned community, right? Which would be developed, totally from the top down, with him being kind of the salesperson and also the hero, and everybody would like him and say that he was cool. That's basically, anyway, was his idea. Okay, so he has this model community that he wants to put on Niagara Falls and use the hydroelectric power generated by the falls to, in his mind, generate unlimited electricity, right? And be able to power homes and businesses, and unlike, Pittsburgh and New York City, where there's people who are struggling, this was going to be like a perfect place where nobody lived in poverty and everybody's just going to be nice to each other and share. Okay, so, as you can imagine, there were issues from the very beginning, right? Eventually, for a number of reasons, he had to abandon this project, right? So, he had dug a canal, essentially, right? And he wanted to use that canal, which, water flows through on its way to drop down the falls, right, as a hydroelectric plant, right? But that part of it never got up the ground, right? So what he essentially did was dig a big hole in the ground. It was like a big, long ditch, right? So the shot of this at the beginning, right, is what it looked like later after, things have been filled in, right, and a lot of other stuff happens. But that's basically what he did, right? And that's why it's called Love Canal. His name was Love. The planned community was going to be called, I don't know, something stupid. But anyway, that's how it got the name, Love Canal. So he abandons the project. The town kind of keeps developing, right? It's an area that a lot of people are interested in for a number of reasons. There's this chemical company, right, Hooker Chemical, which buys the land where Love Canal was and essentially uses it as a big hole in the ground, right, as a dump site, right, and proceeds to dump an unfathomable amount of like 100 different chemical substances in there, right? So you've got acids, bases, right, so caustic is the old word for bases, alkalins, which is basically something that's really basic as well, right? Fatty acids and like really gross smelling, greasy stuff, and just the most horrible toxic sludge that you can imagine, right? And they put it into these barrels and then dump it into the big hole, right? And to be clear, they did implement some safety features, right? There's a lining, there's other seals and stuff in place to kind of contain it as a dump site. They took some appropriate actions to make sure that it didn't spill out all the way into the city, right? It's chemical waste, right? Now, later, they ended up selling the dump site to the district school board for Niagara Falls, right? And the company ended up selling it to the school board for $1. Now, the company themselves could have just said, this is a dump site, we're just going to abandon it, we're just gonna, lay our hands off and, leave it to be condemned, right? But they sold it, and they let the school board know at the time, like, hey, there's this stuff down here, like, there's all this chemical sludge and horrible things, and the school board basically said, we're gonna keep developing it anyway, right? And they poke holes in like the lining that was supposed to seal all the toxic waste up, and they're digging trenches around the area, right? And they do all this development that essentially destroys the containment structures that the company had left in place. Now, to be clear, right, and we'll get to the matter of whose fault it is eventually, right? You can only kind of lay fault on both of them, right? So the company essentially does a half-assed job of protecting everything and cleaning it up because they weren't required to. They basically did the bare minimum, and they kind of only, half-throatedly told the district and everybody else that there was a problem, right, whenever they did the sale. The district, in turn, was also pretty negligent about it and said, full speed ahead, let's develop and worry about the problems later, right? Ask questions later, move fast, and break stuff. Just to give an idea, right? So here's the canal itself, that big ditch with all the toxic waste. They put schools nearby, they had communities nearby, houses nearby, all around the area. And people started to notice over those decades, right? So through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, after the school board had bought it and developed it, put all the residential stuff in, that weird stuff was happening, right? So people would report like black, toxic ooze coming out of the ground. If you dug a swimming pool, it would get like bodied, essentially crumpled and, broken down, right, by the movement of these toxic things down there. There were like barrels with toxic waste that were surfacing out of the ground, like slowly kind of being shuffled up over time through the rain and stuff, and then leaking things, all sorts of weird smells, every weird smell and weird color, black thing you can imagine, right? And, what's happening here, right, is you have contamination of these liquid stuff, the toxic waste, that spreads outward, right? Have this thing called a contaminant plume that spreads, especially through the groundwater systems, right? So as groundwater moves around and it rains, right, and it moves back and forth, it carries the contaminants with it, right? It slowly spreads out in every direction underground, right? Now, people start to notice this, right, and notice weird health effects and smells and all this toxic stuff, right? And they protest, right? And this is a gigantic protest, like massive, massive media coverage of all of these things, folks getting kids mobilized, a huge display of activism, right? And there were these other problems associated. So stuff that takes a long time to kind of notice and develop and get good data on, right? So birth defects, which I have elected not to include photos of, cancers, including leukemia, right? So you have high rates of cancer, you have birth defects, babies being born with all sorts of deformities, right? And people get together and throw up a lot of, fuss about it in a good way, right? I have this from an EPA visit, right? So this is an EPA official who visits during the 70s and sees corroding waste disposal drums, trees turning black and dying, swimming pools that are full of chemicals, puddles of toxic waste, right? Everywhere, especially around people's homes and kids and communities, right? President Carter, right, who was president at the time, 1978, files a declaration of emergency, right, for a totally human-caused disaster. First time that a human-caused disaster had ever led to a state of emergency. Shortly afterward, largely in response to this issue of the Love Canal, Congress passes this thing called CERCLA, which establishes the EPA Superfund designation, right? So not just brownfields, which are places that are like kind of contaminated, but, remediable or fixable, but like places that are ridiculously super toxic to the point where you need to set aside billions of extra dollars to be able to clean it up, and to the point where it becomes especially important to investigate, right, and figure out whose problem it is, right? So this whole saga of the Love Canal is a huge part of why the Superfund designation comes into existence and becomes part of what the EPA does. It's kind of a sprawling program with many billions of dollars. It's a whole thing. Anyway, families evacuate, right? So this is kind of what it looks like today. Everybody leaves the area, something like 1,000 families, which to be clear is far from the biggest environmental problem in the US, right? But it was one that attracted a lot of attention, and it was the first Superfund item ever was Love Canal, right? Families leave, never come back. Many of them are saddled with deformities. Lawsuits go on for dozens of years. Basically, even to this day, there are lawsuits coming out of it. Aerial shot of what it looks like shortly before it was left. This looks like about the mid-'80s, right? Later on, the government comes in and, has these ideas to be able to contain it and clean it up, and does. And the legacy on this one is all the Superfunds, which are now established all across the United States as a result of this issue.